And now, last but most definitely not least, Dr. Omri Ben Yehuda is from the EUME, Europe in the Middle East in Europe, a multidisciplinary research program based in Germany, Berlin. Omri's main field of expertise is comparative literature. He deals with Agnon, Kafka, Bialik, Thomas Mann, and wrote extensively about Mizrahi and Holocaust literature. His new book, The Collapse of Storytelling in Modern Jewish Literature, was published lately by the Hebrew University Magnus Press. Omri asked me, how come we don't have a Palestinian in our panel today? And I thought about it. First, let me use this opportunity to tell that we are going to have a talk by a Palestinian scholar next month. So please follow our website. But anyway, Omri's comment is another proof of his tendency to protest. So the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Avi. I'm so glad to be here with you. We work together on a text on Corona, and you're my historian, whom I can rely on in difficult times. And thank you for these two presentations. I'm sort of perplexed by all this richness and dividedness. I guess my position, and I don't live in Israel since couple of years now. I guess that the protesters themselves in Balfour do present something new and valuable and democratic and vibrant and whatever, but the establishment maybe of the center left in Israel is having difficulties since many years and cannot find its place, and therefore maybe it's like a bit futile in a way. All these many attempts to challenge Netanyahu. It also relates to the fact that Netanyahu is in himself a divided persona. Unlike Trump, he is not a monster. You know, in world politics in the U.S., it's very clear who's the bad guy and who's the good guy. But in Israel, Netanyahu always, challenges the left because he himself is rational sometimes, benevolent sometimes. And during this pandemic, we saw that he's actually part of those who are the good guys by the liberals. You know, he was part of Merkel. He was part of those who took the science very seriously, like Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, or Joe Biden, etc., etc. So now I will just share with you several thoughts that I have, and I worked on these texts that Avi helped me with back then. But I somehow I thought of some other stuff that relate more to Israel. Um, it's not a PowerPoint; it's a Word document. So I thought, and now we celebrate 50 years for the Panterim Shchorim, the Black Panthers protest in Israel. And I thought that it's very interesting that back then it was lechem avodah, bread and labor, and it always revolved around neglect and the lack of food. And there's the story of the milk product that the people of Rechavia had normally got their milk right beside their doors, whereas the Mizrachim of Musrara, which is like maybe 2 kilometers away from Rechavia, they were really deprived of basic food. And I thought about it that the fact that the first slogan maybe that was acquainted with Corona back then, a year ago, was "Stay the fuck home," with extreme gastronomical supplies. And there was some fear at the beginning of lack of food, but then it became really a master chef. I don't know how you call master chef in the US, but this reality shows where people just cook all the time. So that is Corona, and maybe this is part of its discrepancies. So it was also the reverse of protesting, because save lives, which was also another slogan. Why is it that I can't see? Wait a minute. Which means retreat, avoidance, self-restraint, and constant survival at the beginning. And so it's less engagement with the public sphere. Let's keep for now those quotes that I gave from what I wrote. We can go back to it later if we'll have time. So the next point is content. Suppliers were prosperous even more during that time. Netflix, the news, the chase after the new, which wears the ability to judge and differentiate between right and wrong for what is allowed and forbidden. It amazed me all the time that there are so many TV productions all the time, and it seems that the pandemic didn't affect those industries at all. So we are at our homes, and we are like fed, not just with supermarkets, which are the only location we are allowed to go and have fun in, but also with new material all the time. And so the speed of events all the time makes you doubt less and be always passive and in this position of being fed by something. And now Netanyahu versus Trump, which is very, very crucial. Trumpism, so I argue, is actually not something new. At the beginning of his administration in 2016, we thought that this is completely new, this populism, this use of Twitter all the time. But with time, it seemed that Trump actually belongs to a different period. That which valued risk and understood the implication and consequences, meaning inter alia, death. It seems like part of the global industry of the pandemic is not to allow any risk. And Netanyahu oscillates, like I said at the beginning, between the populist, the monstrous, and the moderate, benevolent, rational. The main difference is that Trump, entirely alone in this, now Johnson, at the beginning he was with Johnson, but now he's not anymore. But as he was the president, he was the only leader to not incite fear, which is something quite incredible. This is maybe something I want to read you, because it's a nice thing that I worked on with Avi back then. Indeed, the liberal anxiety about maintaining the existing order with the support of old conservatives is already apparent. Trump was really alone because many of the conservatives has left him. The imperative to save life should be reshuffled so that we do not enclose ourselves in its opacity and are able to see beyond it, namely that apart from that, there are so many other plagues that inflict us. And if you think about it, like in a Trump worldview, the word deal, it's such a Trump word. Death is part of the deal of being alive. And I think this is something that has made him so estranged among all political leaders, for a reason we will get into right in a minute or two. So I'm continuing reading. To understand the cultural crisis, it might be useful to go back to the 90s. How would Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, for instance, would have dealt with the virus? He certainly will not have made daily appearances on television for alarmist presentations as Netanyahu did, and very possibly would not have examined difficult alternatives of lockdowns among vulnerable populations. Most importantly, he would have faced the necessity of coming to terms with losses. What has been lost in our politics, indeed in our entire Twitter area ethos, can be formulated as the readiness to bear consequences, like I said before. So I thought it was very interesting to think of Rabin because Avi told me about his conduct during Milchemet HaMifratz, the Gulf War, and back then he opposed the government decision to use those sealed rooms, HaChadarim HaAtumim, which is really like a promo of coronavirus, because he thought that there is no biological or gas weaponry in Saddam's army. Yeah, let's continue with Trump here. After all the months during which the pandemic has raged among us, Trump has emerged as the only world leader who continues to advocate stoic, albeit chaotic, resilience rather than incite fear, an attitude expressed most clearly in the videos releasing him after his COVID hospitalization. Yeah, a 74-year-old man was able to confront. And in fact, rather than bringing something new, Trump is the very last representative of politics as we used to know it, a form of confrontation with the public space and forging the law tech rather than the high. Hence his insistence on in-person rallies and in-person voting, though the latter is also used as a tactic of voter suppression. So, also during this conflict or opposition to what is happening in the elections, that was also something that was very evident. So now it's a very, very important point that I thought of before writing all these points for this lecture. The new order, which I believe is part of globalization still, of products such as Facebook, who was in an opposition to Trump, and of which Netanyahu was from the first a world leader champion. Yeah, he was really part of those who were for taking measurements. It won twice. First, there was no Brooklyn and Lombardy, which is actually the main goal for having the lockdown, because we understood quite from the beginning it's not a medieval pandemic as they lie to us, all of them. It relates to the elderly, and therefore Brooklyn and Lombardy were completely precarious at the beginning, and that's why there were terrible pictures that arrived from them. So I believe Netanyahu doesn't care about the elderly. He cares about, like every politician, about those pictures of ambulances. And the second, and this is more crucial, is that if life matters, then no Black lives matter, which is, I believe, something of like the displacement, the huge displacement that happened with Corona. And I will get back to it in a minute too. Because what was preceding the Corona was the slogan Black Lives Matter. So now to Netanyahu, which is so important. He's spectacular and populist like Trump, but on the other hand, cautious and liberal. At the end, always deliver the goods, mevit haschora, also for the Israeli left, meaning strategic advantages for the state of Israel, of realpolitik, and the true protest of the Mizrahim against the establishment. So if you think of the Panterim, what has happened with the Panterim in 50 years ago, and you see what is going on today in Balfour, you see that perhaps there are many Mizrahim in Balfour. The Balfour or the protest against Netanyahu is not a protest by the blacks. And what is very, very important for me to say is that contrary to many liberals who believe that Netanyahu uses the Mizrahim, it's perhaps is not conceivable to them, to those writers of the New York Times or Haaretz magazine, but Mizrahim might just as well control him. And the point of legitimizing Netanyahu's struggle during this last year was Chaim Ramon, I believe, because he used to be part of the Labor Party, and he completely supported him, also vis-a-vis Gantz, in this very strange agreement that they made to have a 3-year-old government instead of 4. And what I found amazing is really the Pfizer, hazugiyut, the working together of Netanyahu and Pfizer, because if we take, like, for instance, the super tanker, if someone remembers that, this Trumpism of bringing a huge, massive plane of the United States that should abolish the flames in Haifa. Here in the Pfizer agreement of the vaccines, both the rational and caring and the spectacular and rescuing were evident together, a sheer amalgam of what is Netanyahu or Bibi, which is prosperity in adjusting to the rule of the market. Perhaps we can even dub it liberal populism. And we can skip this. And now also, I will conclude with this, I think. The question that bothers me most is not whether COVID is severe or not, because we know after a year that COVID is not severe. It's severe towards the elderly. It's severe in very, the average is the average of death is only if you're above 80 and you have disease beforehand. So we know all that from May last year. We know all that since May. So this is not the question that I think should interest each and every one of us, but rather why do we spend our time on that question in and of itself? And it has reverberations in thinking about the global South versus the global North. The question isn't, for instance, if we think about the Mizrahim, not whether there is discrimination on Mizrahim, something that I hear every day. Every day people ask me, do you really believe there is discrimination against Mizrahim? We know there is. The question is why we spend our time on this question. So I hope it was in a way trackable what I was bringing here forth, but if I would have to give it a title, it would be the displacement of attention, of the attention from the signified to the signifier. And living now, a year now, we see only numbers coming back and forth before us. The signifier corona, his signified is almost nothing, yes. Remote deaths of the elderly, names and numbers, sometimes even pictures, which yet are again signifier. And if we think about what was before corona, Black Lives Matter, The signifier was the global south, deprivation, social justice, racism, and discrimination. And the signifier were people. They were Blacks, Palestinians, Mizrahim. So I hope it makes some sense what I just gave here. And thank you very much.
More than some sense. I think it was very thoughtful, as usual.